Welcome to 24 Hours of PaaS, the Summit Preview 2016. We're excited you could join us today for Tim Mitchell's session, A Crash Course in Biml. This 24 Hours of PaaS event consists of 24 consecutive live webinars delivered by expert speakers from the PaaS community. The session will be recorded and posted online after the event. To access any on-demand sessions, please visit www.24hoursofpaas.com for all session links. My name is Jens Vestergaard. I have been working with SQL Server since early 2000, mostly on the B side, and lately trying to tackle Azure. I have a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Tim. Next slide, please. If you require technical assistance, please type your question in the question pane located on the right side of your screen and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to the speaker. You're able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the Zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. Please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to complete it. It will appear in your web browser. Next slide, please. I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors, Microsoft, Idera, and Latunity. In addition, I'd also like to thank the supporting sponsors for this event, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and SQL Sentry. The staging of 24 Hours of PaaS would not have been possible without the generous support, and they are the reason this event is available free of charge. Next slide, please. Make sure you explore everything else PaaS has on offer for data professionals. You can join local user groups around the world, special interest groups, find free online resources through our Learning Center, and read up on the latest community news in the Connector newsletter. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to bring to your attention the upcoming PaaS Summit. Taking place in Seattle, Washington from October 25th to the 28th, PaaS Summit 2016 features over 200 sessions with world-class data experts. It's the perfect place to network with experts and peers. And you can meet the Microsoft engineering team behind SQL Server 2016. Save $200 on registration by using the exclusive discount code 24HOP200 before the end of Sunday, September 18th. To find out more, visit paassummit.com. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Tim Mitchell. Tim is a business intelligence consultant, author, and trainer. He is the principal at Tyler's Data Solutions and has been recognized as a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. He has worked with SQL Server for over a decade, specializing in data warehousing, ETL, SSIS, and reporting. Check out Tim's blog at timmitchell.net. Over to you, Tim.
All right, thanks Jens. I appreciate the introduction. So welcome everybody. I appreciate those who are joining me worldwide. For those who are joining me from here in the United States, a very early morning welcome. I'm in the Dallas area, so it's just a little after 6 a.m. my time. So welcome everybody. I do want to welcome you to the final, what I've learned is the final session in the 24 Hours of PaaS. So I understand there are no other presenters after me, so if we run long, we may turn this into the 25 or the 26 Hours of PaaS. Seriously, so what we'll do is we'll give you a crash course to the crash course, if you will. The presentation that I'll be delivering at the PaaS Summit coming up next month will be actually a half-day crash course in Biml. This hour intro or hour-ish intro will have about 45 minutes of content here. We'll give you a bit of an idea of the things that we'll talk about whenever we deliver that content at the PaaS Summit. So by way of agenda, what we'll talk about today here, I'll give you a brief overview of Biml. Some of you may have heard of Biml, some of you may not have, so we'll talk a little bit about what Biml is. I'll talk a bit about Biml script as well, which is really where the power comes in using Biml and building SSIS packages. I'll talk about some of the practical use cases where Biml can be of great value in building out your BI and ETL assets. We'll talk a little bit about the language, and then I've got quite a few demos that we'll go through at the end. I'll briefly, so I think Jens did a great job of introducing me. Most of this is redundant. You can follow me on Twitter, Tim_Mitchell. My blog is timmitchell.net. I think all the other assets that are listed there, Jens covered for me just a bit earlier. So by way of overview, if you haven't heard of Biml, so Biml is a business intelligence markup language. So this was something that came out of, I believe it originally came out of a project within Microsoft that originally morphed into a whole separate company that was started by some former Microsoft folks. And essentially Biml will allow you to automate the creation of your SSIS packages. So it lets you write in relatively user-friendly XML. And for those of you who have dealt with XML, that may elicit a bit of a chuckle. XML is historically not known as a favorite data definition language necessarily for people in the relational space. But once we get into the code, you'll probably see what I mean by user-friendly or easily human-readable XML. But effectively, you're writing XML that while you are hand coding, it's really, really powerful hand coding and allows you to take out a lot of the mundane work that you would otherwise do in your SSIS package development. It's based on pattern-based development, and what I mean by that is if you can look at a set of packages or look at a set of, step back from packages, look at a set of loads that you need to do within your ETL infrastructure. If you can identify patterns where I need to load data from X to Y, I need to make transformations along the wire, and I'm going to do that over and over again. If you can programmatically figure out what that pattern looks like, using Biml can be a big home run for you in terms of shortening that ETL development cycle. It makes for more consistent development because rather than hand coding all of your SSIS packages where you're connecting a data source to a data destination and then doing it again and again and again, using an automated tool, using something like Biml to programmatically generate those will eliminate a lot of the human error in doing those over and over again. That also makes for a more reliable method for development, again, because you're taking out a lot of the human interaction. You're taking out a whole lot of the mundane work that would otherwise be done. I always like to tell the big success story that I had in Biml. So several years back, this was back when I first started in consulting, I picked up Biml. I worked with it for about 2 weeks, and honestly, I walked away from it. I didn't really see a huge amount of value in Biml at that point in time. Fast forward to a couple of years beyond that, pardon me, excuse me. Just a couple of years after that, I had a client that had 500 packages that needed to be developed. So they had 250 tables. We had to take the tables from their OLTP system, land it in a volatile stage area. From the volatile stage, we had to go into a persisted stage area. So 250 tables times 2 packages is 500 packages. So conservatively speaking, you'll spend about 4 hours on a really simple package. 4 hours to spec it out, to develop it, to actually write the code, test the code, do the deployment, go back through any retesting, revalidation processes, and so if you had 4 hours per package, 500 packages, that's about 2,000 hours worth of work. That's a year's worth of work. Now, as a consultant, what that should have looked like is a guaranteed year's worth of work. But in looking at that project, what the client was describing to me, I wasn't overly happy about a year worth of really mundane work where I'm taking data flow and from a relational source to a relational destination and drag the line over and do the same thing over and over again 500 times, test it 500 times. That wasn't terribly appealing to me. So what I did was I rejuvenated, or I stoked the fires on the Biml code that I had used and figured out that that was probably going to be a quicker path to me. For that development. So rather than spending a year of development on that project, what I ended up with was, even coming up to speed on Biml, I was not at all a Biml pro. In fact, I was very much a Biml novice at that point. but I spent about 4 months altogether to bring myself up to speed on Biml, actually develop the code, and saved about 8 months worth of development time. That's not going to be, you're not going to have, so I'm a baseball guy, I like to talk in baseball analogies. That was a grand slam in the bottom of the ninth inning to win the game. Not every project will look like that. You won't have a grand slam every time. But in terms of baseball parlance, you can have a run scoring double. You can have a solid RBI single from time to time. And you can save, maybe not months, maybe you'll save weeks, maybe you'll save days of development time. But at some point, if you are developing SSIS packages, I promise you at some point you will find a project that Biml will really be a good value on. It may not be every project. In fact, it won't be every single project. But there will be projects that you will find value in using Biml. So some of the practical uses that I find, the simple staging is probably the most common, where I want to take my information from my OLTP source, I want to create a simple staging, I want to create an ODS, I want to completely replicate what I already have. Using that patterns-based development that I mentioned earlier, Biml is a really good use for that because it can, again, read the metadata from the source and the destination database and programmatically build your packages. If you're in a scenario where you've got rapidly changing metadata, and specifically if you've got multiple legs in your ETL, so I pull it in from OLTP into staging, from staging into QA, from QA into finally my data warehouse, and someone adds a column, for example, or takes away a column. You have multiple touch points that you have to go through on your Biml or on your SSIS code. If you're generating those via Biml, you can programmatically read the fact that you've got an added column or a column that's changed or been taken away and programmatically create every package along the wire. Save yourself a lot of human interaction there, or a human manual coding there. A large number of similar packages so related to the discussion on simple staging. If you're doing a lot of that where you're pulling in from a database, pull all the tables or all the tables in a particular schema, and you're doing more or less the same types of transformations every time, Biml can be a good option for that. And then using it as a templating engine. Even if Biml won't create the package that you want, it could create 90% of the package that you want, and then you're not developing 100% of the package. You're only developing that custom 10% that Biml doesn't adequately address for you. So there are cases where Biml doesn't fit well. If you've got a lot of widely disparate patterns, so I like to use the Tetris analogy. If you've got a lot of pieces that really don't fit well together, where you've got one, I've got a pattern that looks like the zigzag on the left, I've got another one that's square, I've got another one that's that cursed T shape that nobody likes in Tetris. If you've got a lot of different patterns like that, Biml might not be your best choice. So on a project-by-project basis, I always make the evaluation, would it be less work to do this in Biml and programmatically generate these, or would it be something that I could just do manually and save a little bit of time? Biml is a tool, and again, on a project-by-project basis, I can make that evaluation and based on having done that quite a few times, determine if Biml is a good way to go or if doing it manually is a good way to go. Sometimes Biml is a good option, sometimes, again, doing it manually is. So again, still in going through an overview, most of what we'll talk about, in fact, all of what we'll talk about today and in the class that we have at the PASS Summit, the half-day class, will focus on SSIS development for Biml. There is a commercial product that you can buy. I'm not going to cover that either in this session or in the half-day session. There's a commercial product that you can buy that has a number of other features, including support for analysis services. So if you're interested in that piece, there is some support for analysis services cubes on that. The way that you get plugged into Biml, so there's a couple of different tools that you can use. Bids Helper is probably the most commonly used tool that people use for Biml. The reason for it, Bids Helper has been around forever. It's been around since I think 2005, SSIS 2005. It's a free plugin. It's client-side only. It doesn't have to run on your server. It's completely free and it's a very mature product. If you're using Bids Helper right now, you already have the pieces on your development machine that you need to develop in Biml. There's a relatively new tool called Biml Express, also a free tool, also a plugin for Visual Studio that will let you do Biml development directly in there. I think this is the next evolution where they are, the company that makes Biml is decoupling largely from Bids Helper so they can, I think it's so they can accelerate their development process and not rely on the Bids Helper releases. but this is the next evolution. I won't show you Biml Express yet. It's still relatively new. It looks to be very promising, but that's probably the next place that we'll go in terms of our use of Biml. There's also an online tool appropriately called Biml Online where you can do a lot of your Biml development. You can do package importation and create Biml from an existing package. And then lastly, the commercial tool, we'll not talk about that either here today or in the half-day class at PASS. There's a commercial tool called MIST that gives you more of a graphical environment rather than an XML coding environment if you're interested in that. So to give you kind of a graphical or a visual layout, so imagine the flow looking something like this. So you start off with the Biml code, and I'll show you what the Biml code looks like in just a second. But you'll start off with your Biml code, which is XML or XML mixed with either C# or VB.NET. It runs through your Biml interpreter. Here it's marked as BIDS helper. That could be BIDS helper, it could be Biml Online, or it could be the Biml Express tool that I mentioned a little bit earlier. But once we go through that tool, everything that's created from that is just a plain old SSIS package. The reason I marked those on the slide, I marked those as independent SSIS packages because once you create those packages, they are now no longer dependent on the Biml code. Once you develop that package, you can deploy it just like a regular package. You can modify it just like a regular package because it is just a regular SSIS package that you created. Now, I do recommend that you keep that Biml code around because at some point you'll want to reuse that. You might even want to regenerate the same set of packages. But I want to be clear that if you're using Biml to develop packages, those packages, once created, are no longer dependent on that Biml code. So they are completely self-sufficient and don't require any reference to that Biml code. In terms of the capabilities, think about it this way. Almost anything you can do in SSIS you can do in Biml. Any behavior specifically that exists in SSIS also exists in Biml. So all of your containers, your tasks, if you're using precedence constraints on your control flow, even if you're using multiple precedence constraints, expressions, failure, success, and all that, those are all represented in Biml. Anything that you want to do with expressions is also supported in there. There's a couple of things that I like to point out that it can't do just for clarity purposes. First of all, there are folks that develop SSIS packages, I'm one of them, who like things to be, they like a particular visual layout. So typically going from, if you're on a data flow, from either top to bottom or left to right, they like things sized appropriately where all the tasks and all the containers are the exact same size or similar size. I always like to make the joke that on a data flow, it helps the data to flow faster if you're going from top to bottom because gravity works. Doesn't really work that way. Don't go out and test it. But I do like things to look like a particular way. If you're modeling in Biml, that's one of the things that you can't do. You can't say I want this task to be here, this one to be below it, this one to be below that, and so on. The other thing that you can't do, interestingly enough, at least in the current version, is do annotations. And I want to make sure that we talk about the same thing on annotations. When I talk about annotations, I'm talking about the code comments that you can type into either a control flow or a data flow. Using 2012 or 14 or 16. You can simply click your mouse, start typing, and you can inject a comment in there. Right now, Biml doesn't support that. I expect that to come along in a future version because that's essential for proper documentation of your packages. But just so there are no surprises, do know that those are the two limitations on things that you can't do in Biml that you could otherwise do in integration services. Fairly small issues, relatively speaking, but you do need to be aware of those when you're developing. So we talked a lot about Biml. Let's talk about what Biml script is. Effectively, when I say Biml script, the distinction is that Biml script is XML Biml code mixed with either C# or VB.NET. This is really where you get the power of the Biml language. So if you're hand coding purely in Biml and you're only coding in the XML language, the benefit of using Biml is fairly limited. But once you inject C# or VB.NET, it really becomes powerful because anything that you can do in the .NET language, you can also do in Biml script. Connect to a database, connect to the file system, interrogate a Windows machine, for example, and pull out drive information, drive space information. Anything that .NET can do, you can also do that in Biml script because you're leveraging the full power of the .NET language. Again, using pattern-based development, if I can programmatically figure out what a set of packages needs to look like, if I can read that from a file system, if I can read it from a database, I can easily iterate over that using Biml, just like I described earlier, and create a large number of packages in a short amount of time. So as I mentioned, anything that you can do in .NET, you can do in Biml script. You can use either C# or VB.NET. C# is the default language if you don't specify otherwise, but you can specify if you're a VB.NET person. You can specify that you're using VB.NET. There is some limited support on IntelliSense in BIDS Helper. From what I understand, moving over from BIDS Helper into the new free tool, the Biml Express tool, does enhance the IntelliSense experience. I haven't worked a lot with that yet, but my understanding is IntelliSense is better in that new tool than it is in BIDS Helper. Pardon me. There is an XSD file, an XML structure document file that defines what that language should look like. And within the language, typically it flows like this. You have a collection of items followed by those items themselves. I'll show you what that looks like in a second, but I'll have a collection of packages followed by one or more packages. Within a package, I'll have a collection of tasks followed by one or more tasks. Just like you would see represented in the package itself, that's what Biml looks like. So the language looks something like this. So if you look on the slide, we've got a collection of connections. In this case, I've only got one connection that I'm using. It's a connection to my AdventureWorks database. I've got a collection, you see packages plural, followed by package singular. My package singular is the one that I'm defining the package on. I could have multiple packages in here. In this example, I only have one, but we're creating the package. Within that package, I have a collection of tasks followed by exactly one task, an execute SQL container, or an execute SQL task rather. The language, as I mentioned earlier, this is, if you know even the tiniest bit about any tag-based language, XML, HTML, this will look very familiar, and in about 5 minutes you'll probably figure out, you won't know all the language ins and outs obviously, but you'll figure out the structure of what things look like. This is a fairly typical example of a pure Biml file. So no Biml script, we're not using C# yet. We will in just a second. This is what a typical Biml file looks like, and it gives you an idea of what the language definition will look like. High level, so typically your package is the way that you interact with the Biml file. Your package is the root element, the root piece that you're going to be developing. You can have multiple packages per Biml file, as I mentioned earlier. All of your loops and containers are supported, so if you want to have a for loop, a for each loop, a while loop, or a sequence container, all those are represented in Biml. All of your valid tasks, or all of your tasks in SSIS are supported in Biml. Even if you have a custom task, I have seen some support for those, and I'll put an asterisk beside that, because not every custom task could be fully supported by Biml, and what I mean by that is custom tasks are created in such a way that the developer, whoever created that custom task or component, has control over its behaviors. So there could be cases where a certain behavior in a custom task is not necessarily modeled in Biml, but for the large part, certainly for the built-in pieces and for a lot of the custom tasks that I've seen out on the market, Biml does offer some good support for those, so you can model those out in Biml. On the data flow, every source, every destination, every transformation that you have is fully modeled out. You do have, so this is one of the fantastic features of Biml. If you're creating a data flow, step back just a second. If you're creating a package, you probably know that if you connect to a source, you connect to a destination, and you wire those up, if the metadata matches, if you have an identical column name and a compatible data type, it will do that mapping automatically for you in the UI. Biml will do the exact same thing programmatically when you're creating that. So if I've got 10 columns in my source, 10 columns in my destination, the names are identical, the data types are compatible, when I build that package, it will automatically map those columns over for me. I can override that, and I can say I don't want column A to go to column A. I want column A to go to column Z, or I want column A to be ignored. So I still have control over that, but it will do that automatic mapping for me if I don't specify otherwise. All of your parameters, all your variables are accessible. So if you're using 2012 and beyond, you can create package parameters. You can access project parameters, and you can't create project parameters, at least in the most recent version. You can't create project parameters in Biml. I think that's by design because Biml typically interacts at the package level and not necessarily at the project level. So you can access an existing project level parameter, but you can't create a project level parameter directly in Biml code. But you can access all those values. You can interact with all those variables, set variable values, and so on using Biml. Biml script, again, I mentioned that it is XML and .NET. For any of you who, you'll probably show your age if you identify with this, if you ever came up in the spaghetti code generation like I did, if you ever developed a web page that was mixed with, it was HTML mixed with old VB.NET, we call that spaghetti code because you'd have a kind of a mixture and it's weaving and winding, and you've got part of it is HTML and part of it is VB, and it was intertwined and almost inseparable. We called it spaghetti code. Admittedly, if you're writing a really complex Biml script, it will look a little bit like spaghetti code, but I promise it's really, really powerful spaghetti code. It's a really powerful mix between the XML-based language and either C# or VB.NET. So we add a little bit of complexity in this example. This looks like what we did a little bit earlier. The difference here is that I'm mapping this across where instead of statically defining every package, you can see that I'm setting up an iteration down on about line. Hopefully you can see my mouse when my mouse over here. So right about here, I'm creating a for each loop. So this is just a plain old C# for each loop, and I'm looping through every file path in a particular directory matching star.dtsx. And for each one of those, I will create an execute package task within this package. There might be 0 here, there might be 1,000 here. It takes no more effort to run this for 1,000 tasks than it does for a single task. So you can see where the power of Biml can really come in handy, especially when you mix it in with a little bit of either C# or .NET. Final thing that we'll show on the slide before I jump into the demo, just a quick reference on this is mostly for reference purposes. 4 different types of language structures. We'll explore these whenever I do the half-day presentation at PASS next month. But just as a very quick intro, I can do a regular code block like you see at the top. This is any legal C# or VB.NET command. So create objects, connect to a database. You do have to have in a C# code block or a VB.NET code block, you do have to have, everything has to be properly terminated, begin, try, end, try, begin function, end function, and so on. Or if you're into C#, curly braces, semicolons, and so on. The inline code block is more of an immediate value. I want to get a specific value within a tag. I'll show you some examples of that, how we'll use that immediate code block. The at directive, we call those at directives typically. This is where you import an existing Biml file. This is where you specify the language that you're using, add additional namespaces and things like that. And then finally, a piece that we won't cover today, but we'll talk about in the half-day session at the PASS Summit, is module level code block, where I'm actually defining a function directly in my Biml code, and then I'm using that same function elsewhere in the code. All right, so that's it for the slides. Let's jump in and do a few of those demos. So as you can see here, I don't have, well, I've actually got only one SSIS package set up. We're about to change that. We're going to write some Biml or execute some Biml that will show the power of using Biml. But before I show you the existing code, I do want to show you from the ground up what creating a new Biml file and executing or creating packages from that Biml file will look like. So I'm using bids helper, as I mentioned earlier. So if I right-click, you can see all my Biml files are stored under my miscellaneous directory here, and here are all they are .biml files, just like you might expect. To create a new one, just a bit of a hint on the UI. Ordinarily, if I'm creating a new package, I would right-click on the package and create a new one. If I'm creating a new connection manager, I right-click there and create a new one. However, on the miscellaneous files, if I right-click on here, I know you can't see it, but I'm right-clicking on there and it doesn't do anything. I actually have to right-click on the SSIS packages node, and if I'm using bids helper, the first item that we see there is add a new Biml file. So I'm going to do that. You can see that it does add a new Biml file down at the bottom for me. And what we see here, this is a fully working, fully functional Biml file. It doesn't do anything. It will do exactly what I tell it to do, which is exactly nothing. So this is like an empty main function. We don't even have a hello world in here yet. So I'm going to write just a little bit of Biml. I know you're not typically supposed to type in a demo, but I'll show you just for demonstration purposes how easy it is to write your first Biml file. So I'm going to create my, remember I told you about the language structure. You have a collection of items followed by those items themselves. Typically your starting point will be a package. You are almost always going to have a package definition in your Biml file. So I've got a collection of packages. And I mentioned earlier that you do get some help from IntelliSense. So when I opened up within my packages node here, my packages collection, you can see that when I open up this angle bracket or use the less than symbol, the only option that it presents to me as far as objects is the package. So it is smart enough to know using IntelliSense what items are available to me within whatever context I'm working here. So I only have package available to me. We're going to give that a name, equals, we'll call this hello world. That's our first package. And again, using the IntelliSense or the code automation tools, whenever I ended that tag, it automatically put the closing tag there for me. This is a fully functional Biml file that will create exactly one package. So it doesn't, you can see that it doesn't add right now, it doesn't add any package automatically for me. If you recall the slide that I showed earlier where we have the Biml file, we have the interpreter, and we have the output SSIS packages. The piece that I haven't yet done is I haven't run that interpreter, that middle layer piece. So to do that, I'm going to right-click on that file that I just created. I've got three options for Biml. I'll learn more about Biml, which will just open a web page to show me a little bit about Biml. I can generate the SSIS packages, or I can check the Biml for errors. This won't actually generate the Biml file. It will, or the SSIS packages rather. This will simply check for syntax to make sure that I haven't made any sort of an error in my code or anything like that. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it can be a good check. I'm going to right-click, check for errors. I should get a box telling me no errors or warnings were found. And now I'll go back and actually generate the SSIS package. Now if I go back into my list of packages, now I have Hello World that was just created for me. And if I open that up, this is a fully functional but limited use or limited functionality package. It did exactly what we told it to do. It created a package called Hello World. There's nothing at all in that package. It doesn't yet do anything. So we're going to build out some behaviors in a second. But you can see just creating a very simple Biml file, the UI will actually do a lot of the work for you. It puts in the namespace. It starts you out with Biml. If you type your packages node, it will mostly automatically suggest some things for you. When you're in that packages collection, it will only let you create packages. Once I open up inside my packages collection, for example, again, the IntelliSense will give me some help. It will let me, I apologize, it looks like the tooltip, when I zoom in, it doesn't remain sticky. Let me try that one more time. There it goes. So whenever I open up that less than sign within the package within the package itself, it only gives me the pieces that are specific to that package. So I can specify events, I can use expressions. If I look down a little further, I'll see a tasks collection that will let me specify one or more tasks or containers to use in there. I do want to call out one thing. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that annotations, you cannot use the SSIS annotations in Biml. There's also something in Biml called annotations. It's a completely different thing. It's not, well, it's still related to documentation. An annotation in Biml will let me programmatically, within the Biml object model itself, assign tags or assign values to specific pieces in here. I actually like the annotation logic in Biml better than I do in integration services because it's not just ad hoc. It's actually attached to something. I can specify an annotation for a task, for a component, for those specific pieces, and that documentation belongs to that piece and is not simply wherever you put it on the UI. But I do want to call out, we'll not go over annotations in here. We'll talk a little more about this whenever we do the half-day class at the PASS Summit. but annotations, I want to make sure on the distinction. When you see annotations in Biml, it is a Biml programmatic object model annotation and not an SSIS annotation. So you can see those pieces that we have available to us. If I use my tasks collection, now I can start adding in tasks. I can say I'm going to use an execute SQL task, give it a name. It'll be named whatever, hello world SQL. So now if I save this, now if I go back and check Biml for errors, now it's going to tell me I'm missing some pieces, so I have to specify a connection name. So it's smart enough to know that I'm trying to create a package without all the required information, so it will give me those errors and warnings whenever I try that. So what I would have to do is set up a connection. I'll show you what that syntax looks like in just a second. But I wanted to give you from the ground up, creating a brand new Biml file, this is what we would be looking at. We'd be looking at something like this where it will create the file for me when I right click on the UI and the packages part of the UI, create that Biml file, and it's as simple as just start typing. Now it gets more complicated than that obviously whenever you start adding more complicated logic, but that's effectively how you get started on Biml. So let me close out of both of these. I'm going to show you a few examples that I've already got prepared here. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was that you can create multiple packages per Biml file. So in this case I've got, just like we saw earlier, I've got a packages collection closed out here. I've got multiple packages that are defined here. You can see that I'm creating a package called my first package 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. Within one of those, I'm referencing a connection out here. So this is the piece that had I continued developing that first example that I showed, it would look something like this, where I would have to have a connection reference or a connection definition followed by a reference to that connection before I could use that within my package. But because this is a collection, and again, this is a collection as well, I can have 1 to n number of connections here. I can have 1 to n number of packages here. In fact, I think I can have 0 to n in terms of the packages. I could actually have, if I remember correctly, an empty packages node, and the Biml file is still considered to be valid. So all these will be deployed, or rather all these will be created whenever I execute the interpretation of this. So right-click, generate SSIS packages. We'll give it a second to think about it. And now here are my first package 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, just like we have modeled out here. And if I open up the first one is the only one that I actually did anything with. So open that up, and we should have, here we are. So we do have a reference to the AdventureWorks connection. If I look on that second package, because I didn't build in that behavior on that second package, I have no connection to AdventureWorks. So it's package by package using that reference based on whatever we specify in here. Each package could have multiple connections. If I wanted to instead use project connections, if I'm using 2012 or 14, and I'm setting up my connections at the project rather than the package level, I could consume those using the code that I'm showing here as well. The syntax would look a little bit different, but I could consume those project level connections as well. All right, so I mentioned that Biml itself, just a proper Biml XML without any sort of Biml script mixed in, will have some limited use. While it is fully functional, you're hand coding everything if you're just using Biml. I want to show you a brief example of what Biml script would look like and how you can easily get started with that. Same exact scenario that we had before, where I'm creating 1 to n number of packages. I'm defining my package, I'm giving it a name in here. The difference here is that I'm actually sprinkling in a little bit of C#. You can see that I didn't specify the name of the language in any way, so it's assuming that if I'm using those tags that I mentioned earlier, so this is just a plain code block, if I'm using that, it assumes C#. If I were to use VB.NET, I would have a directive at the top, that @ directive, remember the language reference that I mentioned earlier. We would have an @ directive saying that the language that we're using is VB.NET. So in this case, creating a C# loop, I'm looping starting at 10, going all the way to 20, and incrementing each time, going I++. So for those of you who have written even a couple of lines of C#, this will probably look very familiar to you. For every time we iterate on that loop, and you can see some of the language hints that we have in here. The for loop, I've got the open bracket, I've followed by the closed bracket, and then within that loop, I'm creating 1 to n number of packages. So I'll execute that. And what I should end up with is package 10 through 20. So they don't do anything because we didn't have anything in between our packages node here. So we didn't have any connections, we didn't have any tasks or containers or anything like that. So all those are empty packages. But you can see how just a couple of lines, literally 1, 2 lines of C# code, lets me generate 0 packages, 1 package, or 1,000 packages at one time if I wanted to. One thing that I'll call out on here, so I always get questions about this. So this little, hopefully that's showing up okay on the screen. The highlighted piece that I've got right there, that's actually a comment block. If you're familiar with any tag-based language, XML, HTML, that's indicating that we have a comment there. And it looks like the C# here and here, that's both included in a comment block. The reason that I do that using BIDS Helper, using the interface that we're using here, is to preserve my IntelliSense. The reason I do that is if I don't include that in a comment block, the IntelliSense engine behind the scenes will look at that as just a pure XML file, and we'll try to do that interpretation. And instead of having a couple blue lines here, red lines here, I'll have red lines and blue lines all over the place because IntelliSense is telling me that something is wrong in my code. It's still giving me a little hint that something is not as it expects, but if I put those in comment blocks, in XML comment blocks, effectively it's ignored by the XML part of the file, but because this is done, the interpretation of the Biml file is done on a 2-pass system where it interprets and expands the C# followed by interpretation of the resulting Biml. I can get away with what I'm showing here and preserve most of my IntelliSense. So again, these don't really do anything, but you can see how you can easily generate a large number of packages at one time using a fairly simple loop in Biml script. I'm going to go ahead and delete all those that we created there. So that's an example of, let me close out of what we've got here. No, I don't care to save. So that's a fairly simple example of Biml script. I do want to show you, we haven't talked a lot about what happens on the data flow. We talked about creating a package, briefly talked about what a task would look like. Let's talk a little bit more about the data flow and how you create a connection, or rather create a data flow task that will have a connection to a data source and a destination that will let you write data out to some destination. So collection of packages, my package name, this is the name of the package. I've got a task, just like we're a collection of tasks, just like we saw earlier. In this case, I'm using the execute SQL task, fairly typical use to truncate my staging table. This is the direct input that we're using, truncate table, sales order detail. The connection name that I'm using, which was fully defined up above. It's just that this is just a reference to that previously defined connection. And then I'm creating a data flow task. So I could create this as an empty data flow just like I can in integration services. In this case, I've got an OLADB source, an OLADB destination. My source is my AdventureWorks database. The source table is sales order detail. My destination is AdventureWorks 2012 ODS. And the name of the table there is, instead of sales.salesorder.detail, it's dbo.salesorder.detail. So this is my source, this is my destination. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not doing any data mappings whatsoever. So I'm not saying I want column A to go to column A, column B to go to column B, and so on. Assuming the column names are identical and the data types are compatible, Biml is smart enough to do that automatic mapping for me. So let me run that and I'll show you what that looks like. Right click on that, just like we did before. I'm going to generate a size package, give it a second to think about it. And here's our new package. I'm going to open that up and show you what that looks like. So just like we modeled out in the Biml code, truncate my table. Here's my truncate statement that we set up programmatically in our XML code. And on my data flow task, I've got, just like we modeled out, a source, a destination. This is pulling from AdventureWorks sales.sales order detail. It's writing into AdventureWorks 2012 ODS DBO.sales order detail. Here's where the interesting part starts. I didn't do any of these data mappings myself, but it's automatically pulling over most of those data mappings for me. So sales order ID to sales order ID, carrier tracking to carrier tracking, quantity to quantity, and so on. Those who are really paying attention to the lines going across there, you'll probably ask, well, why didn't it map over sales order detail ID and line total? It skipped both of those. Why did those not map over? Biml is smart enough to know what columns in the destination can be mapped over. So there's two different reasons why these two columns are not mapped over. The first one, sales order detail ID, in the destination table, that's an identity column. It's smart enough to know that it can't, unless you specifically say, I want to preserve these identity values, it will not attempt to preserve that identity value. So it's smart enough to know not to map that over. Line total is a calculated column. So it knows that it can't write to a calculated column because that's not really stored. It's interpreted at query time, so it doesn't try to do that. So you can see, even though we didn't do any of that manually, it's doing a lot of that work for us. And if I run that, what we should get, if I haven't broken anything, we should get all the information coming from sales order detail ID into my staging table, and loads it like that. So fully functional, even though it didn't do a whole lot. It didn't do really any transformation at all. It didn't do any filtering on the data. Mapped over all that data that we had in the source, ripped that out to the destination. Very briefly, I'll show you what adding additional data flow components looks like, and then I'll jump into a more complex example. Same thing that we did before, truncating my table. I'm loading from an OLEDB source into, finally, not one, but two OLEDB destinations. You might ask how I'm doing that. Using the conditional split transformation in integration services. As I mentioned earlier, any piece that you have in integration services, any task, any component, can be modeled in Biml. So I'm splitting based on the line total. If it's greater than $20,000, we're considering that a high value sale, and I'm sending that out to a different destination. And when we run that, give it a second to generate that. There's our new package. Same scenario, truncate and load, but my data flow is now a little more complex in that I'm pulling in data from sales order detail. Now I'm using a derived column transformation that we didn't use before. Using that, just like I showed you a minute ago in the code, I'm using a conditional split to check for high value transactions versus everything else, and it's sending the high value to a different destination than what I specify. All that's controlled purely in Biml code. So I'm telling the Biml code, this is my defined output, I'm calling it high value, and then I'm mapping in based on, here's my high value input going to my high value output, and then everything else goes to just my typical default output, those that don't match that condition. So this can be as simple or as complex as you need it to be. The last couple of things that I'll show you are more complex examples. So if you want Biml to do all the work for you, so we were dealing with about a 150 level complexity. This is probably a 350 to 400 level complexity on a 100 to 500 scale. What we're doing here, instead of telling Biml, I want to get this table and these columns and so on, I'm letting the Biml code do the work on my behalf here. So in this case, I'm writing in my C# code block, just like we defined previously. This is my code block. This is a big block of C#. I'll set up my connection string. I've got a SQL command that will go out and read from my source database, give me all the metadata that I need to use from that. So just using a plain old SQL statement, select distinct schema name, table name, and so on from my sys.tables in my source. And I'm filtering out where the table name is not employee 2. Because that's a SQL query, I could filter out and say I only want to get the tables matching this name, or I only want to get tables in this schema, or I only want to get these 5 specific tables. Whatever that needs to look like, Biml will let me do that work. So from there, I'm creating a table object. Now this is not a database table, it's an in-memory representation. For those of you who have worked with C# or VB.NET, the data table object will probably be very familiar to you. If you haven't worked with C# a lot, you could use something like a string array or an array builder object that would allow you some more flexibility and not have to go into the system.data namespace. Again, it can be as simple or as complex as you need it to be. So creating that, same thing that we saw earlier, I'm creating two connections. I've got a collection of packages. In this case, I'm looping through every row in that virtual table or in that in-memory table that I just created in my C# script above. Create a package for every one of those. I'm going to reference one of the connections that I mentioned earlier. I've got a task that will truncate the table. I've got a data flow task. I'm going to programmatically name that using my immediate directive. So the pound equal, like I showed you in the language reference earlier, this is simply a single value that we're pulling in from our C# representation of that code. Grab the table name, that's how we're naming our data flow task. And then I've got my source, just like we saw earlier, my destination, just like we saw earlier, except that all these values are now dynamic based on the information that we pulled out from our query. So my table name, the schema name, the target table name, or the source table name, destination table name, those are all dynamic based on that query that we ran earlier. So if I run that now, again, a much more complex example, I'm going to give it a second to think about that. So because it's running through all that code, it's interpreting every table that we have in the database, save for one, and with what do we have? So fewer than 100 lines of code. I just created 70 some odd packages, one for every table in my source database. And these are fully functional packages. If I open up, grab business entity, for example, every one of these is fully functional. So I truncate the table business entity. I have a data flow task, and it's pulling in from business entity on my source database, writing into business entity on my destination. It's doing that automatic data mapping for me. Just like we saw previously, it's pulling in row GUID and modified date. Because business entity ID is it's an identity value, it's not mapping that over, although I could override that and say I do want to overwrite that identity value. And when we run this is just an example. This is one of 60 or 70 packages that it just created. But every one of them will do the same thing. It's going to truncate that target table. It's going to use the data flow to load that. Again, in about 100 lines of code, not even 100 lines of code, I've created a package that will, a package for every table in my target database that will build a load process where it can get the data from my source into my destination. It requires zero additional effort to do this for 700 tables, because now that I've got the code written, I can reuse this over and over again. If I need to make some modification on the naming convention, the design pattern, the transformations that are done, I can do it one time rather than 60 or 70 different times, rerun the Biml code and regenerate those files. So again, this is a more complex example. I'll be glad to post this code if you want to tinker with this. When we do the full or the half-day session at the PASS Summit, I've got quite a few more examples that we'll go through. I'll also show you some examples of using Biml Online to actually reverse engineer and take an existing package and create from an existing package the Biml file or the Biml code, so you can see what an existing package would look like represented in Biml. We'll also talk about some more advanced design patterns where we're taking this information not simply from the metadata, but actually creating a mapping file or a mapping table where I'm saying I want column A to go to column X, I want column Z to go to column AA, and creating that mapping, not just assuming that it's a column-to-column mapping, but I'm basically creating in a table the business rules and the mapping rules that I'll use to push those across. So hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea, a bit of a teaser on the bigger types of things that we'll talk about. Even if you're not going to the PASS Summit, hopefully this gives you a high-level overview of what Biml is and the types of things that you can do in Biml. If you are attending the PASS Summit, hopefully this will give you enough information that will make you interested in coming by that half-day session. Join me to learn much more about Biml. I'll be there for the entire duration of that. So if you have any Biml questions, anything that comes up, we'll certainly have some more time to explore some of those more advanced operations. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jens. We do have some time for questions right now. So Jens, what kind of questions do we have waiting for us in the queue?
We actually have a couple, but I think you should maybe spend a quick moment on explaining project connection managers and packages connection managers with respect to Biml.
Okay. That's a great suggestion. So when you're using Biml, you can create, as we showed in here, you can create any package level connection directly in Biml. If you're using project connections, the project works a little bit different than the packages, because if I'm working in Biml, generally I'm creating things that exist in a single package, or I'm referencing something that exists in a project. What I can't do is I can't create from a package, I can't create a project parameter or a project connection. I can consume them. So if I go into my project, in fact, let me exit out of here. I don't have, for this example, I don't have an example of what that would look like, but if I were to create, for example, a project level connection using my project level connection node here, I could consume in any of my Biml files that project connection, consume it by name. But Biml won't let me actually create the project level connection within the Biml file. Package level connections I can. Project level connections I can't create, but I can consume them if they're already there.
Okay. So next question is by Slava, who asks, do you need Visual Studio to run Biml?
Great question. Do you need Visual Studio to run Biml? So the short answer is no. The longer answer is unless you're buying the commercial tool, you do have to have Visual Studio to run that. The one thing that I have to clarify generally when I talk about Biml is that in creating the Biml file or creating the packages using Biml, that's a design time operation where I'm interactively going in, I'm opening up Visual Studio, I'm interactively creating those packages from the existing Biml file. It won't say at runtime go up and read my metadata, interpret that, hey, there's a new column here, and generate new packages based on that. So again, the short answer is no, but if you're not using Visual Studio, you would have to have the commercial product. Or if you're using Biml online, you can do most of what I'm showing online. There are some limitations if you're doing it online, because Biml doesn't, if you're using it online, it doesn't necessarily know what your environment looks like. It can't interrogate your local database to see what tables are in there, for example, or what columns are in these tables. So there are some limitations if you're not doing it in Visual Studio.
And this goes for every version of Visual Studio, even Express?
Oh, that's a good question. So are there any version limitations? If I'm not mistaken, any version of Visual Studio from 2005 to 2015 and any addition, so whether you're using just the BIDS version, the SSDT version, or the full version, as long as you've got the plugins, as long as you've got the components to build SSIS, you can use Biml in Visual Studio, yes.
Okay, so on to some questions on reverse engineering. If you have an existing package, can you import it and convert it to Biml?
Absolutely, yes. In fact, that's part of what we'll go over on the longer class at the PASS Summit. Very briefly, I'll show you, if you go to the website Biml Online, you do have to sign up for an account out there. So, but if you sign up for an account, one of the things that you can do, if you look over to the far left here, you've got package importer. And what the package importer will do for you is I can choose a file. I'm going to do my load controller, for example. So I just specified a local SSIS file that I have on my machine, and it interpreted for me the Biml file. So this is the interpreted Biml from an existing SSIS package. So you do have to use the online tool. You can't do, using just the Visual Studio tools, you can't do what I just showed purely in Visual Studio, but you can do it using Biml Online.
Great. The final question is, where do I get to know more about Biml? So any recommended reading or presentations?
Absolutely. So the one-stop shop for this is probably, let me go back one slide. Your one-stop shop is bimlscript.com. So bimlscript.com, it's a forum, it's actually a full-on learning path. If you want to start out with, hey, I know zero about Biml, or I know a little bit about Biml, it will actually walk you through a learning path. There are articles, there are videos, there are blogs, there are numerous resources out there. So if you're first starting out, or if you just want to learn more, bimlscript.com is the way to go.
Okay, so last comment is actually by Mikkel Svensson, who is saying that from his experience, Bit's helper with Biml is not currently working with SQL Server 2016 and Visual Studio 2015. That's just a heads up, I guess.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't run into that limitation yet.
No, but that sums up all the questions. I guess everyone's happy and answered. No one is left in the queue. So I guess that's a wrap for this session of the 24 hours of PARS, and I'm glad you could join us all, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks everyone. Hope to see you at the PAS Summit.